Imagine being thrown into freezing water by people you trusted, left to die in the darkness beneath the ice. Most people would panic, thrash wildly, and drown within minutes. But what if you possessed a skill so extraordinary that it could turn certain death into survival? What if those 9 minutes underwater weren't your final moments, but the beginning of the most incredible comeback story you've ever heard? This isn't fiction. This isn't Hollywood drama. This is the true story of Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a Navy deep-sea diver whose specialized training became the difference between becoming a victim and becoming a survivor. Her attackers thought they knew exactly how long a human could survive underwater. They were wrong. In the next few minutes, you'll discover how military training designed for the ocean's depths saved a life in a frozen river, how betrayal from trusted colleagues led to an unthinkable act of violence, and how one woman's refusal to give up changed everything. You'll learn about the incredible science behind breath holding that most people never know exists, witness a rescue operation that defied all odds, and see how justice finally caught up with those who thought they had committed the perfect crime. But most importantly, you'll understand why this story matters today, why it's being shared now, and how it proves that human resilience can overcome even the most calculated evil. Get ready for a true story that will challenge everything you think you know about survival, betrayal, and the incredible capabilities of the human spirit. Lieutenant Sarah Chun never imagined that her Friday evening would begin with drinks with colleagues and end with fighting for her life beneath a layer of ice. The 28-year-old Navy diver had spent the last 6 years training her body and mind for the most extreme underwater conditions imaginable. She could descend to depths that would crush ordinary people, work in complete darkness where the pressure could kill, and hold her breath for periods that seemed impossible to civilian observers. But nothing in her extensive training had prepared her for the moment when people she trusted would try to murder her. The evening started innocently enough at Murphy's Bar, a popular hangout spot near the naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. Sarah had agreed to meet 3 fellow officers for what she believed was a casual celebration. Commander James Mitchell had recently received a promotion, and he wanted to buy drinks for the team. Joining them were Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes and Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, all men who had worked closely with Sarah on various diving operations over the past 2 years. What Sarah didn't know was that this invitation was anything but innocent. For months, the 3 men had been involved in a sophisticated smuggling operation, using Navy diving equipment and techniques to retrieve packages from the ocean floor. These weren't military supplies or legitimate cargo. They were moving drugs, weapons, and other contraband for a criminal organization that paid them more in a single month than their Navy salaries provided in a year. The operation had been running smoothly until Sarah began asking questions about equipment that kept going missing from the dive locker. Her attention to detail, which made her an exceptional diver, also made her a threat to their illegal activities. She had started noticing patterns in the equipment logs that didn't match up with official dive schedules. Her questions were becoming more specific, more pointed, and more dangerous to their operation. As they sat around the wooden table in Murphy's Bar, nursing beers, and making small talk about upcoming missions, Sarah had no idea that her colleagues had already decided she was a problem that needed to be eliminated. The conversation seemed normal enough. They talked about the cold weather, upcoming training exercises, and holiday plans. Sarah mentioned that she was looking forward to visiting her family in California for Christmas, just 3 weeks away. Mitchell bought round after round of drinks, encouraging everyone to relax and enjoy themselves. He was particularly insistent that Sarah keep up with the group, constantly refilling her glass and making toasts to friendship and teamwork. What Sarah didn't realize was that her drinks contained a powerful sedative that would make her drowsy and disoriented within an hour. As the evening progressed, Sarah began to feel increasingly tired and confused. She attributed it to a long week of training exercises and the effects of the alcohol, but something felt wrong. Her reflexes seemed slower than usual, and her thoughts felt foggy in a way that didn't match how much she had actually consumed. When she mentioned feeling unwell and suggested calling it an early night, the 3 men exchanged meaningful glances. Mitchell suggested they all get some fresh air before heading home. He claimed he knew a scenic spot along the Potomac River where they could walk off the effects of the alcohol before driving. Sarah, feeling dizzy and disoriented, agreed to the suggestion. She trusted these men completely. They were her colleagues, her teammates, people she had relied on in life-threatening situations underwater. The drive to the river took nearly 30 minutes, during which Sarah dozed fitfully in the back seat of Mitchell's SUV. She was vaguely aware of the conversation in the front seat, but couldn't focus enough to follow what they were discussing. The sedative was working exactly as planned, keeping her conscious enough to walk, but too impaired to fight back effectively or think clearly about what was happening. When they arrived at a remote section of the river, far from any roads or houses, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. The area was completely isolated, surrounded by trees and darkness. Ice covered most of the water's surface, with only a narrow channel of open water visible in the center where the current was too strong for freezing. The temperature was well below freezing, and snow crunched under their feet as they walked toward the water's edge. Webb carried a heavy duffel bag from the vehicle, which Sarah assumed contained diving equipment for some kind of impromptu training exercise. Mitchell explained that they wanted to show her something important, something related to their work that required complete privacy. Her foggy mind couldn't quite process why they would need to conduct any kind of official business at such a remote location so late in the evening. As they approached the water, Hayes positioned himself behind Sarah while Mitchell and Webb stood on either side. The conversation took on a more serious tone as Mitchell began explaining that they had discovered something significant about recent security breaches at the base. He claimed that someone had been stealing equipment and selling information to foreign agents. Sarah tried to focus on what he was saying, but the sedative made it difficult to concentrate. She knew something was wrong with the situation, but her impaired judgment couldn't identify the specific threat. Her military training should have kicked in, warning her of the danger, but the drugs in her system had dulled her instincts. Then, Mitchell's tone changed completely. His voice became cold and businesslike as he explained that they knew she had been asking too many questions about equipment logs and dive schedules. They knew she had been tracking their activities and was close to discovering their operation. He told her that they couldn't allow her to expose them, that too much money and too many lives were at stake. The realization of what was happening hit Sarah like a physical blow. These men, her trusted colleagues, were criminals. They had drugged her and brought her to this isolated location to kill her. Her training finally began to override the effects of the sedative as adrenaline flooded her system. She tried to run, but Hayes grabbed her from behind, holding her arms while Webb removed equipment from the duffel bag. The equipment wasn't for training. It was designed to weigh her down underwater. Heavy chains, locks, and metal plates that would ensure her body would sink to the bottom of the river and stay there. They had planned this carefully, choosing a location where the current would carry her body downstream, away from the immediate area, making discovery unlikely. Sarah fought back with everything she had, using techniques from her combat training to break free from Hayes' grip. But the sedative had weakened her significantly, and she was outnumbered 3-1. The men overpowered her, binding her hands behind her back with military-grade restraints and attaching the heavy weights to her body. As they prepared to throw her into the icy water, Mitchell made a crucial mistake. He began explaining their timeline, telling her that they had calculated exactly how long it would take for her to drown. They knew that cold water would accelerate the process, that most people would lose consciousness within 2 or 3 minutes in water that cold, and that even the strongest swimmers would be dead within 5 minutes. But Mitchell had forgotten something crucial about Sarah's lungs felt like they were on fire as she fought against the restraints underwater. But her specialized Navy training had prepared her for exactly this kind of extreme situation. The breath-holding techniques she had mastered weren't just about holding air in her lungs. They involved a complete transformation of how her body used oxygen, slowing her heart rate, redirecting blood flow to essential organs, and entering a state that most humans never experience outside of life-threatening emergencies. As she sank toward the muddy bottom of the Potomac River, Sarah immediately activated what her instructors called the mammalian dive response. This evolutionary survival mechanism, present in all humans but highly developed in trained divers, causes the heart rate to drop dramatically, blood vessels in the arms and legs to constrict, and the spleen to release stored red blood cells into the bloodstream. Within seconds of submersion, her heart rate dropped from a panicked 120 beats per minute to a controlled 40 beats per minute. The water temperature, hovering just above freezing, actually worked in her favor despite the immediate shock and discomfort. Cold water enhances the dive response, allowing the body to conserve oxygen even more efficiently. While the freezing temperature threatened to cause hypothermia, it also bought her precious extra minutes of consciousness that wouldn't be available in warmer water. Sarah had trained extensively in what the Navy called static apnea, the ability to hold one's breath without movement while remaining conscious and alert. Her personal record in controlled conditions was 8 minutes and 43 seconds, achieved in a heated pool with proper preparation and meditation. But this situation was far from controlled. The adrenaline coursing through her system, the physical exertion required to free herself from restraints, and the psychological stress of fighting for her life all increased her oxygen consumption dramatically. Working methodically despite the growing burn in her chest, Sarah focused on the restraints around her wrists. The men had used military-grade zip ties, assuming that the combination of cold water and time pressure would prevent her from mounting any effective escape attempt. But her underwater escape training had included scenarios exactly like this one. She knew that zip ties, while strong, had specific weak points that could be exploited with the right technique. She positioned her bound hands against her lower back and spread her shoulder blades as wide as possible, creating maximum tension in the plastic restraints. Then, using a technique practiced hundreds of times in training, she brought her arms up and over her head in one explosive motion while simultaneously pushing her hands apart. The zip ties snapped under the sudden pressure, freeing her hands for the first time since being thrown into the water. The relief was immediate, but Sarah knew she was far from safe. Heavy chains were wrapped around her torso, and metal plates had been attached to various points on her body to ensure she would sink quickly and stay submerged. Her attackers had planned thoroughly, using enough weight to overcome even the buoyancy provided by her winter clothing and any air trapped in her jacket. Her training had taught her to prioritize threats in underwater emergency situations. The most immediate danger wasn't the cold or even the weights. It was the carbon dioxide building up in her bloodstream as her body consumed oxygen. Unlike drowning victims who panic and exhaust their air supply quickly, trained breath holders understand that the urge to breathe isn't triggered by lack of oxygen, but by the accumulation of CO2. By controlling this response, she could extend her underwater time significantly. Sarah began removing the chains and weights systematically, starting with the heaviest pieces that posed the greatest threat to her buoyancy. The metal plates had been secured with simple clips and carabiners, designed for quick attachment rather than security. Her attackers had been focused on making sure she sank quickly, not on preventing escape once underwater. As she worked, Sarah monitored her body's responses carefully. She could feel the familiar signs of oxygen depletion that her training had taught her to recognize. First came the slight tingling in her extremities as blood flow was redirected away from her hands and feet toward her brain and vital organs. Then, the subtle change in her vision as her body began prioritizing the most essential functions for survival. The underwater environment presented additional challenges beyond the obvious ones. The river bottom was thick with mud and debris that had accumulated over years, creating a cloud of sediment every time she moved. Visibility was essentially zero in the dark water, forcing her to work entirely by feel as she located and removed each piece of the equipment meant to drown her. 3 minutes into her underwater ordeal, Sarah felt the first strong contraction of her diaphragm. This was her body's way of telling her that carbon dioxide levels were reaching critical points, and that breathing was becoming urgent. But her training had taught her that this initial urge could be controlled, and that she still had several minutes of consciousness remaining if she managed her exertion carefully. She forced herself to move slowly and deliberately, avoiding any unnecessary motion that would consume precious oxygen. Each movement was calculated, each effort focused on the essential task of removing enough weight to achieve positive buoyancy. The cold water had numbed her fingers, making it difficult to manipulate the clips and fasteners, but adrenaline provided strength and focus that more than compensated for the discomfort. For minutes, underwater brought stronger contractions and the beginning of what breath-hold divers call the struggle phase. Her body was now actively fighting her conscious decision to remain submerged, sending increasingly urgent signals to surface and breathe. The primitive part of her brain, unchanged from humanity's earliest ancestors, was screaming that death was imminent and that she needed to breathe immediately. But Sarah's advanced training had prepared her for this exact moment. She had spent countless hours learning to override these signals, to remain calm and functional even when every instinct was demanding that she surface. The key was mental discipline combined with physical technique, using meditation-like focus to maintain control even as her body entered survival mode. By 5 minutes, she had removed most of the weights and could feel herself becoming neutrally buoyant in the water. The relief was enormous, but she knew that the hardest part was still ahead. She needed to swim approximately 20 feet to the surface while her body was in the advanced stages of oxygen depletion. Every movement would consume oxygen she couldn't afford to lose, but remaining stationary wasn't an option. The swim to the surface required careful planning and execution. Sarah knew that she needed to ascend slowly enough to avoid using excessive energy, but quickly enough to reach air before losing consciousness. She also had to navigate around the ice that covered most of the river's surface, finding the open channel where her attackers had thrown her into the water. 6 minutes brought the beginning of involuntary movements as her body entered what scientists call the hypoxic phase. Her diaphragm was now contracting rhythmically, trying to force her to breathe despite her conscious control. Her vision was narrowing, and she could feel the beginning of the euphoria that often accompanies severe oxygen deprivation. This was the most dangerous phase, where many breath-hold divers lose consciousness without warning. Sarah began her ascent, using long, slow strokes that maximized efficiency while minimizing oxygen consumption. Her training had taught her to swim like a dolphin in these situations, using her entire body in an undulating motion that was far more efficient than traditional swimming strokes. Even with numb hands and feet, this technique allowed her to move through the water with minimal energy expenditure. 7 minutes into the ordeal, she could see the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the ice above her. The river had frozen in an irregular pattern, leaving channels and gaps where the current was too strong for complete ice formation. She needed to locate one of these openings, as breaking through solid ice from underwater would be nearly impossible in her weakened state. The euphoric phase of hypoxia was now fully affecting her judgment, and Sarah had to fight against the temptation to simply float upward without actively swimming. Part of her brain was telling her that everything was fine, that she could simply relax and let nature take its course. This dangerous feeling was a well-documented effect of oxygen deprivation, and her instructors had warned her that many experienced divers died because they became too euphoric to take the actions necessary for survival. 8 minutes brought more severe symptoms as her body approached the absolute limits of conscious endurance. Her stroke rhythm became irregular despite her efforts to maintain control, and she could feel her coordination breaking down. The surface seemed impossibly far away even though she knew she was only a few feet from air. Her training included techniques for this exact situation, methods for maintaining consciousness, and motor control even when the body was shutting down from hypoxia. She focused on a simple mantra that had been drilled into her during the most extreme training exercises: surface, breathe, survive. Everything else was secondary to reaching air and taking that crucial first breath. As she approached the 8.5 minute mark, Sarah finally reached the bottom of the ice layer. Her hands, numb and barely functional, searched desperately for an opening large enough to allow her to surface. The ice was thick and solid in most areas, formed over several days of sub-freezing temperatures that had created a barrier between her and the air she desperately needed. Finally, her searching hands found the edge of an opening, a gap in the ice approximately 3 feet wide where the river current had prevented freezing. With her last reserves of strength and consciousness, she pushed herself upward through the opening, breaking the surface of the water exactly 9 minutes and 12 seconds after being thrown in to die. The first breath of air felt like fire in her lungs as her re-breaking the surface, and taking that first desperate breath was only the beginning of Sarah's fight for survival. As she floated in the icy water, gasping and trying to regain her strength, she realized that hypothermia posed just as deadly a threat as the 9 minutes she had spent underwater. Her body temperature had dropped significantly during her time beneath the surface, and the freezing air above the water was actually colder than the water itself. The human body loses heat 25 times faster in water than in air, and Sarah had been submerged in near-freezing water for over 9 minutes. Her core temperature had already dropped several degrees below normal, putting her in the early stages of hypothermia. She could feel the telltale signs her Navy survival training had taught her to recognize: uncontrollable shivering, confusion, and a dangerous drowsiness that would lead to unconsciousness if she allowed it to take hold. Sarah knew she had perhaps 10 to 15 minutes before hypothermia would render her unable to function effectively. The cold was already affecting her motor skills, making her movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Her hands and feet were completely numb, and she could barely feel the ice edges as she tried to orient herself in the dark water. The section of river where she had surfaced was roughly 30 yards from the nearest shore, a distance that would normally be an easy swim for someone with her training. But in her current condition, weakened by oxygen deprivation and rapidly losing core body heat, 30 yards might as well have been 30 miles. Every stroke would be a battle against her body's declining ability to function. Making the situation even more dangerous was the ice formations surrounding the small opening where she had surfaced. The gap was only about 3 feet wide, barely large enough for her to tread water without constantly bumping into the solid ice edges. The ice was thick enough to support some weight, but she could see that it was uneven and unstable, with cracks and weak points that made it impossible to simply climb out and crawl to safety. Sarah forced herself to think clearly despite the fog of hypothermia clouding her judgment. Her survival training had covered scenarios exactly like this one, and she knew that panic would kill her faster than the cold. She needed to make smart decisions quickly before her cognitive abilities deteriorated further. The first decision was which direction to swim toward shore. In the darkness, with no landmarks visible and her night vision compromised by her recent underwater ordeal, she had to rely on other senses to orient herself. She listened carefully for sounds that might indicate the direction of the road where the men had parked their vehicle, reasoning that roads typically ran parallel to shorelines in this area. She could hear the faint sound of traffic in the distance, which gave her a rough direction toward what was probably the main road. But swimming directly toward that sound would mean crossing the widest part of the river, a distance that she probably couldn't cover in her current condition. Instead, she chose to swim at an angle, heading toward what she hoped was the nearest shore while also moving in the general direction of potential help. Before beginning her swim, Sarah took several deep breaths to fully oxygenate her blood and calm her racing heart. Her pulse was elevated both from the stress of nearly drowning and from the early stages of hypothermia, which causes the heart to work harder to pump blood through constricted blood vessels. She needed to manage her exertion carefully to avoid exhausting herself before reaching shore. The swim began as a careful balance between speed and energy conservation. Each stroke had to be deliberate and efficient, as her numbed hands and arms were operating at perhaps 50% of their normal strength. The breaststroke, which she normally avoided because of its relative inefficiency, became her best option because it kept her head above water and allowed her to maintain visual contact with her destination. After swimming for what felt like hours, but was probably only 5 minutes, Sarah realized she was making poor progress. The current was stronger than she had anticipated, and it was carrying her downstream even as she fought to reach the shore. Worse, her stroke rate was slowing as hypothermia continued to affect her muscle function and coordination. She paused her forward progress and floated on her back for a moment, trying to assess her situation objectively. Her survival instructors had taught her that the greatest danger in survival situations was continuing with a plan that wasn't working instead of adapting to changing circumstances. She was burning precious energy swimming against a current that was proving stronger than her weakened condition could overcome. Looking around more carefully, Sarah noticed that there were several large rocks or concrete structures visible near what appeared to be the shoreline. These weren't natural formations, but rather some kind of artificial breakwater or boat launch area. If she could reach one of these structures, she might be able to climb out of the water even if she couldn't make it all the way to shore. She adjusted her swimming angle to aim for the nearest visible structure, a concrete pillar that appeared to be part of some kind of dock or pier system. The distance was still significant, but it was much more achievable than trying to reach the natural shoreline against the current. As she resumed swimming, Sarah became aware of voices in the distance. At first, she thought it might be her attackers returning to check on their work, and she felt a surge of fear that almost caused her to panic. But as she listened more carefully, she realized the voices were coming from a different direction entirely, and they sounded like people engaged in normal conversation rather than criminals conducting surveillance. The voices gave her hope, but also presented a dilemma. Should she call out for help, risking that her attackers might hear and return to finish what they had started? Or should she continue trying to reach safety on her own, knowing that she was running out of time before hypothermia would incapacitate her completely? Her training had taught her that in survival situations, getting help was almost always better than trying to handle everything alone. But her military background also made her acutely aware that calling for help could put innocent bystanders in danger if her attackers were still in the area. She decided to continue swimming toward the concrete structure while listening carefully to determine whether the voices represented genuine help or potential additional danger. The swim to the concrete pillar took another 10 minutes of exhausting effort. By the time she reached it, Sarah's coordination had deteriorated significantly, and she was having trouble maintaining steady forward progress. Her hands were so numb that she could barely feel the concrete when she finally grasped the edge of the structure. The pillar was part of an old boat launch that had been partially destroyed by years of ice damage and flooding. What remained was a concrete platform about 2 feet above the water level, with metal reinforcing rods sticking out at various angles. Under normal circumstances, climbing onto the platform would have been trivial for someone with her athletic training. In her current condition, it represented a nearly insurmountable challenge. Sarah tried several times to pull herself up onto the concrete, but her arms lacked the strength to lift her body weight, and her numb hands couldn't maintain a secure grip on the smooth concrete surface. Each failed attempt cost her precious energy she couldn't afford to waste, and she could feel herself getting weaker with each passing minute. Finally, she managed to hook her elbow around one of the protruding metal rods and use it to lever herself partially out of the water. It took 3 attempts and left her gasping with exhaustion, but she was able to get her torso onto the concrete platform. From there, she managed to swing one leg up and roll completely out of the water for the first time since being thrown into the river. Lying on the concrete platform, soaking wet, and shivering on the building Sarah had been stumbling toward turned out to be a river management station operated by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. 2 park rangers, Mike Rodriguez and Jennifer Walsh, were working late to monitor ice conditions and update safety reports when they heard weak knocking on their door at nearly 11 o'clock that night. When they opened the door, they found a woman who appeared to be suffering from severe hypothermia, soaking wet, and barely able to stand upright. Rodriguez immediately recognized the signs of advanced cold water exposure. Sarah's skin had the characteristic pale blue tinge of hypothermia. She was shivering so violently she could barely speak, and her movements were uncoordinated and sluggish. Most alarming, she kept repeating that people had tried to kill her and thrown her in the river, claims that initially seemed like the confused ravings of someone suffering from severe hypothermia. The Rangers immediately called for emergency medical assistance while beginning treatment for hypothermia according to their wilderness first aid training. They wrapped Sarah in emergency blankets, moved her close to their heater, and gave her warm liquids while carefully monitoring her vital signs. Rodriguez had seen hypothermia victims before during his 15 years as a park ranger, but Sarah's case was among the most severe he had encountered in someone who was still conscious and ambulatory. While Walsh focused on medical care, Rodriguez called local law enforcement to report the incident. Sarah's repeated claims about being murdered seemed increasingly coherent as she warmed up and her mental state improved. She was able to provide specific names, locations, and details that were too consistent and detailed to be hypothermic confusion. Rodriguez realized they might be dealing with attempted murder rather than an accidental cold water incident. Emergency medical technicians arrived within 20 minutes, followed closely by detectives from the Maryland State Police. Paramedic Lisa Chun, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, was shocked by the patient's condition and survival story. Sarah's core body temperature had dropped to 89 degrees Fahrenheit, well into the severe hypothermia range where death is common. The fact that she had survived 9 minutes underwater followed by hypothermic exposure was, in Chin's professional opinion, medically remarkable. Detective Ray Morrison took Sarah's initial statement while the EMTs continued treating her hypothermia. Despite her physical condition, Sarah was remarkably coherent and provided a detailed account of the evening's events. She identified her attackers by name and rank, described the location where they had thrown her into the water, and explained the smuggling operation she believed had motivated the murder attempt. Morrison was initially skeptical of some elements of Sarah's story, particularly her claim of surviving underwater for 9 minutes. However, her knowledge of Navy diving procedures and her detailed description of breath-holding techniques convinced him that her account might be accurate. More importantly, her story contained specific details about equipment, locations, and procedures that could be verified independently. While Sarah was being transported to the hospital for advanced treatment of hypothermia and possible internal injuries, Morrison began coordinating with Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents. The allegations against 3 Navy officers required immediate attention, particularly if they involved an ongoing smuggling operation that could compromise national security. NCIS Special Agent Caroline Foster arrived at the hospital within 2 hours of Morrison's call. Foster had extensive experience investigating corruption within military ranks and recognized immediately that Sarah's allegations, if true, represented a serious breach of naval security. The described smuggling operation would require detailed knowledge of diving procedures, access to specialized equipment, and the ability to operate without detection by base security. Foster's first step was to verify Sarah's identity and credentials. A quick check of Navy personnel records confirmed that Lieutenant Sarah Chun was indeed a qualified deep-sea diver with extensive training in advanced breath-holding techniques. Her service record indicated numerous commendations for underwater rescue operations and specialized training in extreme environment survival. This background supported the plausibility of her survival story. Meanwhile, Morrison and his team were investigating the physical evidence at the scene where Sarah claimed to have been thrown into the water. Using GPS coordinates she had provided, they located the remote area along the Potomac River. Fresh tire tracks in the snow matched Sarah's description of the vehicle used by her attackers. More importantly, they found the heavy chains and metal plates that had been used to weigh her down, which she had removed underwater and left on the river bottom. The recovery of the physical evidence was crucial to the investigation. The chains and weights bore military markings that could be traced to specific equipment inventories. Serial numbers on some of the metal components would eventually lead investigators directly to the diving equipment locker at the Norfolk Naval Base, providing concrete proof that military equipment had been used in the attempted murder. While physical evidence was being collected, Foster began building cases against the 3 accused officers. Commander James Mitchell, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes, and Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb were placed under discreet surveillance while investigators gathered evidence of their alleged smuggling activities. None of the 3 men knew that Sarah had survived, which gave investigators a significant advantage in monitoring their communications and activities. The investigation revealed that Sarah's suspicions about missing equipment had been entirely accurate. Detailed analysis of diving equipment logs showed a pattern of gear being checked out for unofficial operations that didn't correspond to any authorized training or mission activities. The missing equipment included exactly the types of specialized diving gear that would be necessary for underwater cargo recovery operations. Financial records proved even more damaging to the suspects. All three men had been making regular large cash deposits that far exceeded their military salaries. Bank surveillance footage showed them making these deposits on dates that corresponded to known drug seizures by the Coast Guard, suggesting they were being paid for successful smuggling operations. The most compelling evidence came from electronic surveillance of the suspects' communications. Believing that Sarah was dead and their secret was safe, the three men continued conducting business with their criminal contacts. Federal agents recorded phone calls and intercepted text messages that provided detailed evidence of the smuggling operation, including schedules for upcoming cargo retrievals and payment arrangements. Foster's investigation revealed that the smuggling network was more extensive than Sarah had suspected. The three Navy divers were part of a larger operation that included corrupt Coast Guard personnel, civilian boat operators, and members of organized crime families operating along the East Coast. They had been using their specialized diving skills and access to military equipment to retrieve drug shipments that had been deliberately dumped overboard when smugglers faced interdiction by law enforcement. The operation was sophisticated and had been running for over 2 years without detection. Smuggling vessels would approach the U.S. coast and dump their cargo in predetermined locations when threatened by Coast Guard patrols. The corrupt military divers would later retrieve the submerged packages using Navy diving equipment, allowing the criminal organization to recover valuable cargo that would otherwise be lost. Sarah's questions about equipment discrepancies had threatened to expose the entire network. Her attention to detail and systematic approach to inventory management had identified patterns that could have led to discovery of the operation. Rather than risk exposure, the conspirators had decided that eliminating Sarah was their safest option. The investigation also revealed how close Sarah had come to being killed even after surviving the underwater ordeal. The conspirators had planned to return to the river the following morning to ensure her body had sunk and wouldn't be discovered by accident. If she had remained unconscious from hypothermia much longer, they might have found her before she could reach safety and finish what they had started. Medical experts consulted during the investigation confirmed the arrest of Commander James Mitchell, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes, and Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb took place simultaneously at 0600 hours on a Tuesday morning, exactly 8 weeks after they had thrown Sarah into the Potomac River. Federal agents and military police coordinated the operation to ensure that none of the suspects could warn the others or destroy evidence. All three men were taken into custody without incident, though Mitchell's shocked expression when agents informed him that Sarah Chun was alive became part of the case file documentation. The federal courthouse in Baltimore became the center of what would be called one of the most significant military corruption cases in recent history. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Martinez, had assembled overwhelming evidence against the defendants. The case included charges of attempted murder, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, bribery of military personnel, theft of government property, and violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Sarah's testimony was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, but Martinez knew that her survival story was so extraordinary that it might strain the jury's credibility. To address this concern, the prosecution brought in Dr. Amanda Foster, a military physiologist who specialized in extreme survival situations, to explain the scientific basis for Sarah's underwater survival. Dr. Foster's testimony detailed the physiological adaptations that allow trained breath-hold divers to survive underwater for extended periods, particularly in cold water conditions. The defense attorneys, led by prominent military defense counsel Colonel James Harrison, initially attempted to discredit Sarah's testimony by arguing that her account of surviving 9 minutes underwater was physically impossible. However, this strategy backfired when prosecution witnesses demonstrated that Sarah's training and physiological capabilities were well documented in her military records. Video evidence of her achieving similar breath-holding times during training exercises made it impossible to dismiss her survival as fabricated. Perhaps more damaging to the defense was the extensive physical evidence that corroborated every aspect of Sarah's testimony. The chains and weights recovered from the river bottom bore fingerprints and DNA evidence linking them to all three defendants. Bank records showed the suspicious cash deposits that coincided with known smuggling activities. Most crookily, the electronic surveillance evidence captured the defendants' own words describing their crimes and their relief at believing Sarah was dead. During the 2-week trial, the full scope of the smuggling operation was revealed to the public for the first time. Prosecutor Martinez presented evidence showing that the network had successfully retrieved and distributed over $50 million worth of illegal drugs over a 2-year period. The operation had compromised national security by using military equipment and personnel for criminal activities, and it had corrupted the integrity of naval operations along the eastern seaboard. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Sarah took the witness stand to describe her ordeal. Speaking clearly and methodically, she walked the jury through every detail of the evening, from the drugged drinks at Murphy's bar to her desperate swim to shore after 9 minutes underwater. Her testimony was delivered without emotion or dramatics, but the stark facts of her survival story held the courtroom spellbound. Defense attorney Harrison attempted to challenge Sarah's testimony during cross-examination, focusing on inconsistencies in her timeline and questioning whether her memory could be trusted given the trauma she had experienced. However, Sarah's military training and natural attention to detail served her well on the witness stand. She was able to provide specific times, distances, and technical details that were later corroborated by expert witnesses and physical evidence. The defense's only hope was to argue that the defendants had acted impulsively rather than with premeditation, hoping to reduce the charges from attempted murder to assault or manslaughter. However, this argument collapsed when prosecutors presented evidence of the elaborate planning that had gone into the attack. The pre-selected location, the prepared restraints and weights, the careful timing, and the coordination between all 3 defendants clearly demonstrated premeditated intent to commit murder. After less than 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges against all 3 defendants. Commander Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for attempted murder and conspiracy charges. Lieutenant Commander Hayes received a sentence of 35 years in federal prison. Chief Petty Officer Webb, who had cooperated with investigators and provided testimony against his co-conspirators, was sentenced to 20 years with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The conviction of the 3 Navy officers was just the beginning of a broader investigation that ultimately dismantled the entire East Coast smuggling network. Federal agents used information gathered during the naval corruption investigation to identify and prosecute over 30 additional defendants, including Coast Guard personnel, civilian boat operators, and organized crime figures. The total value of drugs and other contraband seized during related operations exceeded $100 million. Sarah's role in exposing the criminal network earned her numerous military commendations and civilian awards for valor. The Navy recommended her for the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for extraordinary heroism, making her one of the few women to receive the award for non-combat actions. The citation specifically mentioned her courage in surviving an assassination attempt and her dedication to exposing corruption within military ranks. However, Sarah's victory came with significant personal costs. The trauma of nearly being murdered by trusted colleagues, combined with the physical effects of her underwater ordeal, required extensive therapy and medical treatment. She developed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that affected her sleep, concentration, and ability to trust others. The Navy provided comprehensive psychological support, but her recovery was a long and difficult process. The attempted murder also ended Sarah's career as a Navy diver. While she had suffered no permanent physical damage from her ordeal, the psychological impact made it impossible for her to return to underwater operations. The claustrophobic feeling of being submerged, even in training conditions, triggered panic attacks and flashbacks to her near-death experience. After 18 months of unsuccessful attempts to resume diving duties, Sarah made the difficult decision to leave military service. Her transition to civilian life was aided by numerous job offers from companies that valued both her technical expertise and her demonstrated courage under pressure. She ultimately chose to work for a marine safety consulting firm that specialized in underwater rescue operations and diving safety protocols. Her unique experience surviving an underwater murder attempt made her an invaluable resource for developing safety procedures and training programs. Sarah also became a sought-after speaker at military and civilian diving conferences, where she shared her survival story and the lessons learned from her ordeal. Her presentations focused on the importance of proper training, mental preparation, and ethical leadership within military organizations. She emphasized that technical skills alone were not sufficient for survival in extreme situations, that mental discipline and moral courage were equally important. 3 years after the trial, Sarah married Dr. Michael Torres, a Navy physician who had been part of her medical treatment team during recovery. Their relationship had developed slowly as Sarah learned to trust again and overcome the psychological effects of betrayal by people she had considered friends and colleagues. Dr. Torres understood the unique challenges faced by military personnel dealing with trauma, and his patience and support were crucial to Sarah's healing process. The couple settled in San Diego, California, where Sarah established a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing support for military personnel who had experienced trauma related to corruption or betrayal within their units. The organization, called Integrity Under Pressure, offered counseling services, legal assistance, and advocacy for service members facing situations similar to what Sarah had experienced. 5 years after her ordeal, Sarah reflected on how the near-death experience had changed her perspective on life and service. While she would never fully recover from the betrayal by her colleagues, she had found new purpose in helping others facing similar challenges. Her survival had not only exposed a criminal network, but had also led to significant improvements in military oversight and ethics training programs. The case became a landmark in military justice, frequently cited in legal training and ethics courses at military academies and law schools. Sarah's survival story became part of Navy diving instruction, used to teach advanced breath-holding techniques and underwater survival skills. Her experience proved that proper training and mental preparation could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah's courage in reporting the criminal activities of her colleagues, despite the personal cost, reinforced the principle that military service requires absolute integrity and moral courage. Her willingness to risk her career and safety to expose corruption demonstrated the highest ideals of military service and inspired a new generation of service members to maintain ethical standards regardless of personal consequences. Today, Sarah continues her work with Integrity Under Pressure while serving as a consultant for military diving safety programs. She has never returned to underwater operations, but her legacy in military diving is secure. Her survival of 9 minutes underwater in freezing conditions remains one of the most extraordinary feats of human endurance ever documented, and her courage in the face of attempted murder continues to inspire others facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. The 3 men who tried to kill her remain in federal prison, their military careers and reputations destroyed by their criminal actions. Their attempt to silence Sarah Chun had exactly the opposite effect, amplifying her voice and ensuring that their crimes would never be forgotten. In trying to destroy one honest service member, they had ultimately strengthened the integrity of the entire military system they had tried to corrupt. That Sarah's survival was extraordinary even for someone with her specialized training. Dr. Robert Kim, a naval medicine specialist who had worked with military divers for over 20 years, stated that surviving 9 minutes underwater in near-freezing conditions would be impossible for most people, even those with extensive diving experience. Sarah's combination of advanced breath-holding training, cold water conditioning, and exceptional physical fitness had saved her life. The investigation took 6 weeks to complete as federal agents gathered evidence against all members of the smuggling network. During this time, Sarah remained in protective custody while receiving treatment for the physical and psychological effects of her ordeal. She required several weeks of physical therapy to fully recover from the effects of hypothermia and oxygen deprivation, but her long-term prognosis was excellent. Foster made sure that Sarah's survival remained secret until the investigation was complete. The 3 men who had tried to kill her continued their normal duties, unaware that their every move was being monitored and their communications intercepted. This allowed investigators to gather evidence against the entire smuggling network rather than just prosecuting the attempted murder case. The breakthrough came when electronic surveillance captured Mitchell discussing plans for another cargo retrieval operation. Federal agents were able to monitor the entire operation, from the initial dumping of cargo by the smuggling vessel to its recovery by the corrupt divers. Video footage of the illegal diving operation provided irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy. As the investigation neared completion, Sarah was briefed on the extensive evidence that had been gathered. She learned that her near-death experience had led to the discovery of a criminal network that had smuggled millions of dollars worth of drugs and other contraband. Her survival and courageous reporting had prevented countless future crimes and potentially saved other lives. The case was ready for prosecution, with evidence linking the suspects to attempted murder, smuggling, conspiracy, and corruption of military personnel. But the legal proceedings were just beginning, and Sarah would need to testify about her ordeal to ensure that justice was served for the crimes committed against her. Controllably, Sarah took stock of her situation. She was out of the immediate danger of drowning or hypothermia from water immersion, but she was still in serious trouble. Her wet clothes were freezing to her body in the below-freezing air, and she had no source of warmth or shelter. If she stayed where she was, she would probably die of exposure within an hour or two. The voices she had heard earlier were still audible in the distance, and they seemed to be coming from somewhere along the shoreline. She could see lights in that direction, suggesting some kind of building or facility where people might be able to help her. But reaching those lights would require walking at least several hundred yards in her current condition, and she wasn't sure her legs would support her. Sarah forced herself to stand, using the concrete pillar for support. Her legs were shaking from cold and exhaustion, but they held her weight. She began walking slowly toward the lights, staying close to the shoreline where the footing was more stable. Every step was an effort, and she had to stop frequently to rest and regain her balance. As she got closer to the source of the lights and voices, Sarah could make out the shape of a small building with vehicles parked nearby. It appeared to be some kind of ranger station or maintenance facility, probably used by the Parks Department for river management. The presence of official vehicles gave her hope that she would find people who could help her and who would know how to contact proper authorities. But even as she approached potential safety, Sarah remained acutely aware that her ordeal was far from over. The men who had tried to kill her believed she was dead, which gave her a temporary advantage. But once they learned she had survived, they would certainly try to finish what they had started. She needed to reach help quickly, not just to treat her hypothermia and exposure, but to ensure that her attackers couldn't strike again before law enforcement could intervene. The final 100 yards to the building felt like the longest distance she had ever traveled. Each step required enormous willpower as her body tried to shut down and conserve heat. But the knowledge that safety was within reach gave her the motivation to continue moving forward, one painful step at a time, toward the lights that represented hope and survival. Spiratori's system struggled to process oxygen after being deprived for so long. She gasped and coughed, floating in the freezing water while her body readjusted to breathing. The air temperature was well below freezing, creating steam as her warm breath met the cold night air, but she had never been more grateful for anything in her life. But even as she floated there breathing, Sarah knew that her survival was far from guaranteed. She was in hypothermic shock, her core body temperature had dropped dangerously low, and she was still in the middle of a frozen river with no immediate way to reach shore. The men who had tried to kill her believed she was dead, which gave her an advantage, but only if she could survive long enough to use it. Aris training. As a Navy deep-sea diver, she had undergone specialized breath-holding instruction that pushed the boundaries of human physiology. She had trained extensively in cold water survival techniques, learning to control her heart rate and oxygen consumption in extreme conditions. Most importantly, she could hold her breath for up to 9 minutes in calm conditions, and potentially longer in survival situations where adrenaline and training could extend her limits. The three men lifted her struggling form and threw her into the dark, icy water of the Potomac River. As she hit the surface, the shock of the cold water fully cleared her head of the remaining effects of the sedative. Her training immediately kicked in as she sank beneath the surface, weighted down by the chains and metal plates they had attached to her body. Instead of panicking, Sarah forced herself to remain calm and assess her situation. She was underwater, bound, and weighted down, but she was still alive and conscious. Her specialized training had taught her that panic was the enemy of survival, that controlling her breathing and heart rate was essential to extending her underwater endurance. As she sank toward the bottom of the river, Sarah began working on the restraints that held her hands. The men had used standard flex cuffs, which could be broken with the right technique and enough force. Her underwater combat training included escape and evasion techniques specifically designed for situations where a diver might be captured or restrained underwater. Above her, the three men stood at the water's edge, watching the spot where she had disappeared beneath the surface. They were confident that their problem had been solved, that Sarah Chun would never surface again to threaten their operation. They waited for several minutes to ensure she was dead before returning to their vehicle and driving back toward the base. But beneath the dark water, Sarah was far from dead. She had successfully freed her hands and was working on removing the weights that threatened to drag her deeper. Her lungs burned with the need for oxygen, but her training allowed her to remain focused and methodical even as her body screamed for air. The water was shockingly cold, probably around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, which would normally incapacitate most people within minutes. But Sarah's cold water training had taught her to manage the physiological effects of hypothermia and to function effectively even when her body temperature dropped significantly. She knew she had limited time before the cold and lack of oxygen would overcome even her enhanced abilities. Every second counted as she worked to free herself completely and reach the surface. Her attackers had made one crucial miscalculation in their murder plan. They had underestimated the very skills that made Sarah valuable as a Navy diver, the same skills that would now save her life. As she finally freed herself from the last of the restraints and began swimming toward the surface, Sarah realized that surviving the water was only the beginning. She still had to get out of the river, find help, and expose the men who had tried to kill her. The real challenge was just beginning, and everything depended on whether she could reach the surface before her breath ran out.